Hey y'all, welcome to the Her Hustle How to Start a Podcast session. I am Dr. Tiffany Wiggins, and I am the founder and creator of Black Girl Mentor LLC and the host of the Black Girl Mentor podcast. I am so thankful to have the opportunity to be in community with you all, and am so excited to share both my experience as a podcaster as well as provide some direction and helpful resources that will help you get started on your own podcast journey. Over the next several minutes, I'll discuss my background, my podcast show, things to consider when launching a podcast, as well as some things to avoid, and how to use your podcast as a side hustle to make some additional money. Due to the nature of the content that I'll be sharing, as well as for accessibility, I decided to create a presentation that I will reference as I talk so that you can more easily capture the information that I'll be speaking about. So just a moment as I pull up the presentation. All right, so here is the presentation and we're going to get right into it. So I want to share a little bit about me so you can know who I am. I am, again, Dr. Tiffany Wiggins, and I'm a native of Norfolk, Virginia. So that's in the southeastern side of the state. And some people reference it as Hampton Roads or the 757. My professional background has been primarily in higher education. I am a practitioner scholar. I have over a decade of experience working in both student affairs and academic affairs at various institutions of higher learning up and down the East Coast. I am the mom to my 8-year-old daughter, Zara. I have 3 degrees. I graduated from Christopher Newport University, which is in Newport News, Virginia, where I received my bachelor's in business administration. I attended the George Washington University for my master's degree in human resource development, and I earned my PhD in higher education from Old Dominion University, also in Norfolk, Virginia. Some personal things about me: I love to travel, I love great food and trying new restaurants, and of course attending concerts and festivals. Unfortunately, haven't been able to do that over the past several months due to COVID, but definitely looking forward to that as soon as safely possible. But outside of that, I do also enjoy watching TV, lots of reality TV, to be honest. I love documentaries, and I also love listening to podcasts outside of my own. So a little bit about my podcast, the Black Girl Mentor podcast. I launched season 1 in May of this year. So right at the height of the coronavirus pandemic is when my podcast launched. I'd already had intention to start the podcast in the year 2020. It just so happened to start around May. So did 12 episodes in the first season, as well as a few additional bonus episodes throughout that time. I am the sole host of my show, so I do not have a co-host. However, it is an interview-based show. So most of my episodes, I have a guest on who I'm talking to regarding their experiences with mentorship. It is a weekly episodic show. So every week while I am in season, there is a Black Girl Mentor episode that you can listen to, and my show airs on Wednesdays. The focus of my show is that we center the power, purpose, and practice of mentorship for, by, and amongst Black women and girls. So that is what my show is about. And usually when I'm talking and or talking with my guest, that is the center of what we're talking about. And there at the end is my URL for my show. So my show is hosted on Anchor. And if you want to go directly to my show, to listen to my to my episodes, you can follow anchor.fm /Black Girl Mentor. So getting started with your podcast, these things here on the screen, please pay attention, screenshot it, whatever you need to do. But these are the main things that you want to consider when starting your podcast. First, you want to think about, what is the concept or the focus of my show? What is your show going to be about? That is going to be so important because you want to make sure it's something that you're passionate about and interested in, that there is an audience for it, and that is something that is going to align with your life and your work. So some things to think about when trying to narrow down what is the concept or the topic of your show. You want to think about things that, what interests you? What am I passionate about? What is something that I can talk about for probably anywhere between 8 to 12 episodes? What is something that people come to me about, maybe asking for advice, or that I'm really good at or know a whole lot about? Those are things you want to consider when you're thinking about the concept of your show. Next, you want to think about the structure of your show. Is this going to be a show that airs once a week, twice a month, Daily, that's also an option. What is that each episode going to look like? How's it going to start out? It's going to start off with music. It's going to start out with an ad. Is it going to end with someone else talking? Like all those things you need to think about when talking about the structure of your show. I mentioned before that, I do seasons. Not every podcaster does seasons. Some podcasters literally just record, on whatever schedule that they say they're going to do. So if they're going to be a bi-monthly show, then twice a month, ongoingly, they record, they don't pause for season breaks. So those are things that you want to consider in terms of your structure for your show. Next, you want to talk about the name. So once you have your concept, the structure, what is the name of your podcast going to be? You can always kind of throw out a few ideas based on, again, the focus of your show, or maybe your own personal interest, or if there's kind of some funny backstory to it. You can kind of come up with a few options and then maybe share it with friends and family, or maybe even your social media followers, for them to give you some feedback in terms of what name resonates with them the most. And then, of course, you can come up with your podcast art, which you will need to host your podcast, which we'll talk about in just a second. But you also want to have it as a way for folks to identify your show. You want your show to stand out from the rest, especially if it's something or around a topic that there are other shows that kind of are in the same category. You want to make sure that your podcast art stands out so that no one gets lost finding your show on the various platforms. So right here on the screen, that is my podcast art. It's a little altered from the logo for Black Girl Mentored. So I kind of took that logo, put it into Canva, used some of the design elements, some of the design elements, and this is what I came up with, and that is what I use for my podcast art. Next, you want to have a hosting platform. I mentioned before that my show is hosted on Anchor. There are other platforms as well that you can use to host your podcast. So you want to consider on what platform do you want to host your show. Your host is going to be from where your podcast is broadcast to other podcasting platforms, such as Apple Podcasts and so forth. And that is where the distribution comes from. So you have a host from where it's kind of like the home of your podcast. Where's your podcast housed, right? But then, you want to make sure that everyone can hear your podcast as much as possible. So then it gets distributed to other platforms. So that could be like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Spotify. Those are some of the other podcast platforms that you can use to distribute your show. Of course, you're going to need some equipment to get started, right? So most podcasters will use a microphone in order to amplify their voice for their audio podcast. So most podcasts are strictly audio. There are a few that also have a video component, and that is another option that you have. But regardless, you want to make sure you have a great microphone so that the audio quality is as great as it possibly can be. You also may want to look into a pop filter. That's the screen that goes in front of your microphone to ensure that some of those sounds are diminished a little bit. So a lot of times when people use P sounds or T sounds, having that pop filter in front of your microphone diminishes some of that, so it's not so loud or distracting on the listener side of the audio. And then you can also decide if you want to use a stand or an arm for your microphone. That really is a personal choice, depending on if you decide you just want to kind of have a stand right here in front of your microphone, and you just kind of talking to it. Some people who like to move around a little bit or may have some dynamic spaces in which they record may perform the arm. So that way your microphone is right in front of your face, but you can kind of move it a little bit based on your own movements or your own kind of individual space to make for a little bit more flexibility. Also, you want to think about you're going to need a computer, whether that's a desktop computer or a laptop. Many podcasters use laptops because that allows them to kind of record and or edit their podcasts regardless of where they are. So you want to have a computer that's going to have everything you need in order to not only record, but to publish your podcast, and then also editing software. Once you've recorded everything for your podcast, you'll need to make some edits to that audio file in order to make it ready to to publish and then distribute on the various platforms. So here's some other things that you should consider when launching your podcast. Excuse me. All right. So, of course, you have your podcast and you want all the listeners, but you want to figure out the best way to promote your show. So, social media is definitely a way to do that. And you can use whatever you feel most comfortable with or where you feel like there may be the most support and followership for your show. I say create or use because some podcasters will use their own personal social media account and just talk about their podcast there, especially if they already have a pretty good following. And some podcasters will create a totally separate handle or account for their podcast. It's really up to you and kind of where you are in terms of your social media engagement at the start. You can always switch later. You can start with your personal account, and then if you find like it's better to kind of move that traffic to a separate account, you can do that. But you definitely want to have a way to promote your show. You want to think about the time it'll take to prepare, to schedule your guests and to interview them, as well as to edit before each podcast episode. So as I mentioned before, my show airs on Wednesdays. I need to think about, okay, thinking backwards, if my show is going to air on Wednesday, by when do I need to have my script ready? By when do I need to interview my guests? By when will I have the editing done? And then when will I post it to Anchor to then be distributed? Talking about distribution, one thing I do want to mention is sometimes when you're distributing to other platforms such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it may be a little bit of time that it will take in order for those shows to kind of come over to those other platforms. Apple Podcasts, for instance, initially you have to create an account, and it takes maybe up to 2 weeks before that account is approved to then air your shows. So take those things into consideration, especially for your first launch. If you want your launch date, you want people to be able to get to it on Apple Podcasts, know that you may need to build in some time to have everything, that application process done so that your show will be ready for Apple Podcasts by your launch date. You also want to take into consideration the space in which you are recording and the ambient noise around you. So again, audio, you want your audio quality of the sound as great as possible. So you want to be in a space where there's not going to be a lot of distractions or background noise to kind of get in the way of that. So if you live by yourself, that's great, but you may have a roommate, or you may want to record when your roommate's not home, or maybe in an isolated space. Some podcasters go into their closet to record because a lot of times that's going to keep a lot of that out, that background noise out of the way. And it kind of keeps the sound in and creates great quality for your audio. You also want to think about the guests in which you're going to bring on your show. If you're going to have guests at all, you don't have to. But if you're going to bring on guests, that could work in your favor or not. So you just want to make sure that you kind of have thought about the reason why you're bringing your guests into your show, how they're going to serve your listeners, how they're going to bring value to your show, and also what their reputations may be, whether it's good or bad. If they have great reputations and people love them and they align with the focus and the structure and concept of your show, perfect, right? Then it can only go up from there. But sometimes you may bring someone in who may not necessarily align with your show, or may not necessarily resonate well with your followers, or maybe something comes up about them where their reputation doesn't look so great. And then that could also, it might impact just that episode, but it could impact your show entirely because it may look like you're endorsing that person, especially if it's something that's not well received. So think about it, right? Like, just make sure you do your due diligence and you do the work to determine if this this guest that you're going to bring onto your show is going to be advantageous to your brand and to your show. And then lastly, especially as a new podcaster, I found great support in podcaster Facebook groups. They've given me another avenue to not only promote my show, but also to ask questions and to get feedback about certain things. They seem to, so far, have been really great, really supportive, and really opened my eyes up to the many possibilities that podcasting can have for me, from, just like I said, from a topic standpoint, but also in ways in which to make my show really dynamic and really engaging for my audience. So here I just listed 3 of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of as it pertains to podcasting: She Podcasts I think it's actually, yeah, She Podcast is actually for women podcasters, Women of Color podcasters for women of color podcasters, and then Podcast Movement really embraces all podcasters, but really tries to focus on ways in which kind of elevate your platform as a podcaster and solidify it more as a business. Here are some common mistakes when launching a podcast. Sometimes people do not do practice or run throughs, and I would advise against doing that. You want to make sure that you've done a run through not only with the script maybe of your show or the flow of your show, but also the equipment and the software that you're using, especially in the beginning. You want to make sure that you feel comfortable, because if not, it's going to show either in the recording or in the production of your show. So if you want to make sure you're practicing, kind of like I said, the flow of your show, how you're going to interview, how you're going to welcome your guests onto the show, how you're going to introduce yourself, all of those things you want to make sure you know how to do, especially the software piece. If you're not used to using audio software to do editing, make sure you have some time and take some time to practice that, to maybe play around with like a dummy file to see, okay, well, how do I cut this, or how do I blend this, or how do I add the music? Like all those things are really important to make sure that you kind of have as seamless of a launch as possible. And of course, you'll get better and better as time goes on, but you don't want to be totally unaware of how to use these things in the beginning. Another common mistake is not having a clear focus or goal. So you want to make sure that it is very clear that your show is about whatever it is you want your show to be, and that your guests will get what they think they're going to get out of it. That allows you to hold yourself accountable, and then it allows your guests to hold you accountable as well. You don't want to over or under edit. Over editing is super time consuming and sometimes takes away some of the authenticity of your show. But under editing sometimes can be distracting. So if there's some blaring distraction in the background, or noise, or something else that isn't relevant to your show, or maybe you go off on a tangent and it extends, the time of your show, you want to make sure you edit that out so that your show kind of stays on course and is giving not only yourself, but your listeners what it is that you all are looking to get out of the show. You want to make sure you are being consistent. So again, what is it that you're planning to do? What time is your show supposed to air? On what day? What is the sequence or the frequency in which that show is going to launch? Be as consistent as possible. And you want to make sure that you are setting expectation that you can deliver on. So you don't want to tell your audience, well, this is going to be a daily show. Monday through Friday, you can expect a podcast episode from me, knowing that your life doesn't allow for that to happen. So make sure you are setting expectations that you can deliver on. If you're going to say, I'm going to have this guest on the show this season, make sure you can secure that guest for your show for that season, because you don't want to lose trust in your audience, and you want to make sure that you are holding yourself accountable to the things that you say you're going to do. You can do whatever you want to do as a podcaster. There really aren't tons of rules in terms of content and structure and those sorts of things, but just make sure that whatever it is that you say you're going to do, that you communicate that with your audience. So for instance, I just finished season 1. I've told my audience leading up to the end of season 1 that I was going to take a break between seasons. So it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't them waiting for episode 13 to air. They knew after episode 12, we're going to take a break. And then she'll come back in season 2 later. So just make sure you're being communicative, you're setting realistic expectations, and you're being as consistent as you possibly can. Here are just a few helpful resources. I've been talking about the microphones, the hosting, recording, and editing software. So I just wanted to kind of make this available to you all. You kind of take a screenshot of it if you want to, or write it down. And that way you can do research on maybe some of the resources that are going to be helpful for you as you launch your podcast. For me, I just will share what I use, but feel free to, of course, do additional research and do what feels more comfortable for you in your show. So in terms of microphones, I use the Samson Q2U. I host my podcast on Anchor, which is a free platform, but some of these others require a monthly subscription. In terms of recording software, I use Zoom mostly because I'm doing a lot of remote interviews, and Zoom just makes it very easy to navigate for both myself and the guest, as well as to get the files and upload them and that sort of thing. And then editing software, I use GarageBand, which is specific to Mac computers. So if you do not have a Mac, you won't be able to access GarageBand, but Audacity, Auphonic, and Adobe Audition are also great editing softwares to use as well. And then lastly, touching on ways in which to make money podcasting. Of course, there are tons of other ways to do that. And here I just kind of highlighted 4 of the main areas that I know about. Sponsors and ads, that's the big one. Most places, or if you talk about podcasting and money making, you're going to talk about sponsors and ads. A lot of times your host, your podcast host is going to kind of make some of those connections for you, but a lot of times it's going to be based off of how many listens you have. So in the beginning, it can be a little difficult to get as many sponsors just solely off of your host, but you can always pitch brands to get additional sponsorships and ads. If you listen to podcasts, you'll get a sense of kind of some of the more common companies that will sponsor podcasts, and that is where you can kind of start in terms of pitching. If you decide to kind of take that on as additional, because you want to get additional revenue through this stream of sponsors and ads. You can also get merchandise. So Black Girl Mentor, we have a merchandise site through Teespring. You can do it yourself or through another platform, but you'll see very common that you can do t-shirts and hats and cell phone cases and pins and all sorts of things that you can do in terms of merchandise as another way to kind of support and promote your podcast, but also to bring in additional money. Events, both live and virtual, are very common for podcasters to do. Of course, not so many live events as of late, but that is something that happens where podcasters will do live podcast sessions. So there's an audience as they're recording their podcasts, and that brings in, of course, people pay to attend and they do that. But there's now, with COVID especially, there's been kind of an uptick of virtual events that are happening as well. So you can kind of have people pay for a live or a workshop or something like that as it pertains to your podcast. And then there's digital products as well. So I've seen ebooks and templates and also online courses that are related to the topics of podcasts. Those are other ways in which you can kind of use digital products to support your podcast and make additional revenue. Oh, and then there's also, I mentioned before that you can have a video component to your podcast. So a lot of times people will upload their video recordings of their podcast to YouTube. And if you have a YouTube channel, of course, if you have enough subscribers and watch hours, then you can make additional money through YouTube. So that's another place as well. And then there's, of course, Patreon. So you can have subscribers through Patreon who will support your podcast, and they can kind of pledge so many dollars a month to support your podcast. So that's another way in which podcasters can make money. But of course, there's so many other more, but due to time, we can only kind of highlight those for now. And then of course, here are the steps to launching your podcast. We've gone through them all. I just wanted to kind of have one slide that really kind of shows you in order. Decide on your concept and your structure. You want to create a name and then your podcast art. You're going to determine and acquire your podcasting equipment and software. And I want to highlight here that you don't necessarily have to purchase your podcasting equipment. I would check with your university library or your local public library to see if they are willing to allow you to check out podcasting equipment, because that might be a way in which you can kind of get started without putting a lot of financial investment in the beginning. Then you want to set up your podcast host and then create your Apple Podcast account. And then you record, you edit, and you publish. And that is how you get your podcast started. So that is starting a podcast for Her Hustle. So much more we can talk about, so much more I'm willing to share with you all. Please feel free. I really want to connect with you all. Feel free to reach out to me, ask me any questions that you have. Here on the screen is my email address. Please reach out. And then on social media, I'm on most platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, as well as Instagram. So at Black Girl Mentor is where you can find me. Please reach out, connect. I'm so thrilled about sharing this information with you all. I hope you consider podcasting. It has really changed my life in a way that I did not expect it. And I am just happy to share my journey with you all and help you as you start your journey as a podcaster in any way that I can. Thank you and take care.